Hey pirate fans around the world. This is Mosquito Coast, the pirate Wild West. You never knew. Where jungle rivers met warm Caribbean currents, fast sloops, mosquito allies, and logwood fortunes turned a forgotten shore into piracy's roughest frontier, half marketplace, half battleground. A coastline, said little in the grand stories of ports and taverns, turns suddenly central when the lens widens. Here, imperial borders ran thin, indigenous power decided outcomes, and small fast boats outran big reputations. The promise is clear and quick. A wild west of the Caribbean, where British privateers, Spanish patrols, and Mosquito leaders played a long game of raids and treaties, where logwood money and turtle fleets bankrolled operations, where rivers became highways and courts, and where what looks quiet on a map was noisy with decisions that shaped the age. The scope runs from Cape Gracias a Dios down through Bluefields, Black River and the Corn Islands, with staging out toward Rautun and Old Providence, always evidence-led, with each claim weighed as attested, contested, or legend. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy and want to fall asleep with pirate stories whenever you want. Why this coast hooked so many, and why it still grips attention, begins with geography and opportunity. The main Spanish lanes hugged predictable arcs between major ports. This fringe sat a short reach away yet felt worlds apart. Safe anchorages hid behind mangroves. Lagoons stretched like mirrors under the trade-wind sky, and the reef's broken teeth opened just enough passes to welcome a captain who knew the color of water that meant safe depth. Imperial reach was long on paper and short in canoes. Local alliances were not a footnote. They were the rule book when a sloop slipped into a river mouth. The crucial facts were not the flag at the stern or the paint on the hull. The crucial facts were who waited on the bank, what promises had been kept, and how fast the current ran against the tide. Immediate magnets glittered without theatrics. Dyewoods, logwood first, then mahogany, turned sweaty cutting into export cash. Turtle oil filled casks that lit lamps across oceans. Cacao pods fell like currency. Silver moved nearby overland and coastal routes, tempting raids that were less about cannon smoke than about timing. The myth of lawlessness arrived later. In the moment, it felt more like a busy edge-of-map economy, where enforcement preferred harbors, not river bends. The present tense belongs here too. Expeditions still scan lagoons. Archives still yield letters. Coastal communities still carry names and languages that remember how these waters worked. Memory is not a relic in this story. It is a tool. A calm map moment places the listener's inner compass in the right quarter. Cape Gracias a Dios forms a wind-bent shoulder between today's Honduras and Nicaragua, where river mouths braid into the sea through sandbars that shift like napkins in a breeze. Bluefields Lagoon stretches inland like a shallow inland sea, mirror flat in morning before breezes scribble on it. Black River, negotiated and renamed across eras, channels fresh water and rumor out to the reef. The Corn Islands, bright in today's tourist brochures, once meant water, wood, and a view over shipping lanes. Farther afield, the Bay Islands and the Old Providence region served as springboards and storehouses, a loose archipelago economy where a sloop could duck in for water or a sloop could disappear like a fish in shade. Terrain equals tactics here. Mangroves do more than shelter birds. Their roots knit water and land into 100 places to tie up, patch a sail, or wait out a patrol. Bars and reef passes create a code in color. Pale means sand. Deep blue means depth. Sudden darkness might be coral or might be shadow. The crews who live by such codes learn to read the sea like a page. Surprise flows downstream in this world. A quiet canoe can move a dozen men up a river that a deep draft patrol cannot enter at all. Storms help too. Oncoming rain makes the sea a chalkboard that erases small wakes and muffles oars. Hurricane seasons, chart patterns, and the way wind bends through gaps on the coast all set the calendar for raids without anyone writing a date. Indigenous alliances and the Mosquito polity stand at the center of the wheel. The Mosquito were not passive neighbors in someone else's drama. They were decisive actors with maritime skill, political hierarchy, and networks inland and along shore that reached farther than any European fort on this coast. Recognition of Mosquito kings by British officials did not create authority. It acknowledged leverage already present on the ground and on the water. Gifts, muskets, cloth, tools, moved both loyalty and capability. Joint campaigns against Spanish settlements fused local river scents with foreign powder and rigging. Cultural exchange did not happen in a museum. It happened at sea. Phrases crept into shipboard slang, canoe design informed how periaguas were built, tactics adapted in both directions, attested British Mosquito coordination in raids and patrols, contested the neatness of later narratives that make every alliance stable, and every promise kept. Reality was closer to weather patterned, but full of squall. The frontier economy paid the bills that courage alone could never cover. Logwood cutters, sinew deep in mosquito hume, and resin, stacked dyewood into rafts and sent the product outward, where London merchants calculated profits from pieces cut by men who never saw a counting house. Mahogany crews felled giants and learned the art of moving mass with tide and leverage. Turtlers eased dugouts over shallows at night, turned slow grace into meat and oil, and salted barrels that sailed as surely as bullion. All of this work lived under the canopy of contraband. The legal and illegal bled together where papers could be written in a tent and signed on a plank. Rum, cloth, powder, and iron came in. Dyewood, turtle, cacao, hides, and sometimes human captives went out, depending on the season and the moral weather of the moment. The money math favored those who could move quickly and carry little overhead. Low capital, high risk, quick liquidity, a formula that beat the formal port economy whenever a governor's attention drifted. Ports, inlets, and hideouts were more function than facade. Bluefields offered the broad embrace of a lagoon, where a vessel could careen heel over, scrape its bottom, and mend what the reef had scolded. Black River gave freshwater timber and a middle distance from major garrisons that felt like a safety margin. Sandy Bay and the Corn Islands served as watchtowers and pantries. Out toward Rotan and the Old Providence region, harbors turned into warehouses without walls, where canvas, rope, and stories were traded with equal enthusiasm. What made a place matter was a short list: water, wood, lookouts, local allies, and at least 2 exits if trouble came over the horizon. A textbook port with wharves and warehouses mattered less than a cluster of camps with canoes drawn up like sleeping dogs. Spain struck back where it could. Coastal patrols raised sails like eyebrows at every unfamiliar mast. Punitive expeditions burned camps, cut down shelters, and carried off tools, only to find the same camps half rebuilt before the ash cooled. Forts were proposed, and sometimes started. Disease and storms rewrote budgets and garrisons faster than engineers could lay a foundation. A detachment that fought bravely at a river mouth in March could be half sick by April and gone by June. The survivors carried back to a safer port by the very winds they had meant to use in pursuit. Case snapshots repeat. A settlement torched, a sloop seized and carried into a governor's harbor, under protest and pride, a villainous community, dispersed by official report, but noted by the same report as found again upriver. Control did not fail for lack of effort. It failed because mangroves, rivers, and alliances will always beat abstract lines on a European map when the ground favors the local. Letters of marque turned the same crews from outlaws to contractors in the time it takes to sign a paper. Anglo-Spanish wars lit beacons across the Caribbean. In one season, a captain could be a pirate by proclamation, and in the next, a privateer with a seal on the same activities. Colonial governors balanced propriety against usefulness. A sloop that irritated a neighbor could, under the right war, become an asset, licensed to strike the same enemy ships it would have struck anyway. Opportunists read the weather of politics as carefully as the color of water over a bar. Contracts and commissions painted a veneer over realities that remained muddy around the edges. Raider today, trader tomorrow, died the third day. Convenient deniability flowed both ways, all the way back to London and Madrid, when queries about excesses arrived on desks far from mosquitoes and mud. River war made the frontier feel like a chessboard flipped on its side. Canoes and periaguas, stout, shallow, and quick, could ascend where schooners sulked. Night moves were standard practice. Torches kept low, paddles soft, listening as much for frogs and birds as for the cough of a sentry. Sandbar ambushes turned bends into traps. Portages lifting boats over short ground where water failed, leapfrogged the heaviest patrols. The corridor along the San Juan to the lake and beyond tempted strategists who dreamed in canals and in lines on maps. Campaigns gathered the bold and the unlucky, marched fever into the ranks and wrote lessons in sweat. Tropical rivers are not highways for those who do not love them first. When imperial plans attempted to turn this wet stairway into a grand route, climate and supply shouted down ambition. Yet the effort itself reminds listeners of scale. Whoever controlled these rivers could whisper threats into the interior communications of a whole empire. Crews and communities formed a tapestry, not a slogan. Mosquito navigators and hunters sat at the bow and read river and reef by sound. Creole craftsmen repaired hulls and rigging with precision, learned from fathers and uncles. African-descended Maroons, runaways and their descendants, brought knowledge of coastal survival and inland trails that doubled the map's width in an afternoon. British sailors rolled canvas and counted shares with eyes on the weather. Others from across the Caribbean mixed in, each with a word, a habit, a superstition. Camp life stitched these strands into daily routine. Nets went out, fish smoked over slow fires, meat hung from poles. Barter with inland groups exchanged iron and cloth for food and knowledge. Justice did not arrive at the end of a gavel. It arrived as a gathering around a fire, as a quiet word from a respected elder, or as a cut in shares when laziness or theft cost the group a day. Paths to freedom and captivity crossed here without warning. A man could leave a plantation, find a crew and build a name. He could also be captured and marched under guard to a fort that knew only categories that never fit real lives. Rough justice and custom replaced books. No one carried up a tributary. Shares mattered more than speeches. A prize taken meant division according to prior agreement, part to the captain, part to officers if they existed. A portion to the crew, a portion held back for repair and future stores. In camp, disputes settled in forms that varied by habit. Some used coins, some used labor, some used exile as the last and hardest punishment. Formal articles from buccaneer days existed in memory and sometimes on paper, but rivers and lagoons demanded adaptation. Theft from a common store bit twice, once in loss and once in trust, so penalties bit hard in return. Desertion could be forgiven if it led to a better alliance. It could be punished if it put the rest in danger. Here law traveled by canoe and wore the faces of those present. Craft and tactics favored small over grand. Sloops and schooners with modest draft, spars that could be struck quickly, and crews that knew how to take in canvas at the first hint of a squall did better than heavy ships bristling with guns. They could not bring into shallow water. Periaguas, broad, stable canoes hewn from single trunks or planked to size, carried men and goods over bars that would make a frigate captain curse and turn away. Surf bar crossings needed nerve and skill. A hand on the tiller, reading the rhythm, could time a break and slide through where a misread would capsize the unwary. Bar channel reading was not a trick. It was an education learned in ankles and eyes. Reef shadowing, a tactic of running in the lee of the coral where ocean swell loses its strength, made a fast boat faster. Logistics were humble and decisive. Fresh water first, always. Smoked turtle and salted fish kept bellies full without rotting. Wooding, gathering fuel and timber went on whenever time allowed, because a mast split by gust or a spar cracked by error could end a voyage faster than any enemy. Smuggling lanes and supply chains, drawn on a glass pane, looked like spider silk after a rain. Routes to Jamaica offered markets, powder, and the kind of gossip that functions as intelligence. The Bay Islands served as a mid-journey pantry and hospital. Cayman crews traded turtling knowledge for rum and hardware. Upland trails connected to inland contraband markets, where plantation houses and smallholders alike swapped coin for goods they were not supposed to have. False flags turned into a language of convenience. Forged papers gave a patrol just enough to hesitate. Rendezvous signals across lagoons, smoke at noon, a lantern at a certain height, a sail reefed in a particular way turned the coast into a private code. Buyers were not only roguish mariners, garrisons bought food when budgets failed. Plantation managers bought tools when shipments missed their tide. In a frontier economy, demand looks a lot like necessity, with the labels scratched off. Myth versus record sorts itself cleanly when patience is applied. At tested elements stand tall. Mosquito alliances, joint raids, logwood camps that rose and fell with seasons, and privateering cycles that stamped official wax onto familiar actions. Contested elements shrink under scrutiny. Perfect treasure caves mapped with skulls and arrows. Cinematic pirate towns, with taverns every 20 paces. Grand sea battles, fought a mile inside river mouths. Silence in the archives speaks as loudly as ink, where missionary accounts, naval logs, and colonial correspondence go quiet on a spectacle that later storytellers adore. The quiet means something. It rarely means that everyone forgot the best part. It usually means the best part was added later to make a good campfire great. Heads up on this: the absence of treasure chest finds does not argue against activity. It argues for a use and move economy, where goods transformed quickly into money, or into more supplies. Survival on a hard coast has no romance under close inspection, just respect. Hurricane seasons carve memories into sand and leave new channels where old paths sat yesterday. Fevers arrive without introductions, mosquito-borne, water-borne, passed in a bowl or in a touch. Supply collapses. Surprise even the prudent. A spoiled cask or a missed rendezvous turns a comfortable camp into a hungry one. Medical improvisation is a craft learned under pressure. Herbal knowledge from indigenous partners treats bites, fevers, and infections that would otherwise turn a scratch into a farewell. Limits remain. A broken leg deep inland complicates the arithmetic of compassion. A storm that carries away half a camp leaves the other half to decide between rebuild now or retreat and return. Many disappearances blamed on curses were likely the ordinary cruelty of weather and disease. Profit and risk, counted over a year. Explain why this frontier never emptied. Share systems under privateer commissions promised a cut of each capture after fees. Freebooters without papers kept more praise, but carried greater legal risk. Typical hauls from small coasters, flour, cloth, tools, coin, seemed dull until multiplied by frequency. Outfitting costs, hull repair, canvas, powder, food, turned every quiet week into profit or loss depending on whether a captain saw maintenance as discipline or as delay. Loss rates were real. Wrecks on the reef wrote sudden endings. Ambushes on river bends punished carelessness. Arrests in foreign ports reminded everyone that a commission earned in one harbor could sound hollow in another. A quiet pivot many captains made away from constant raiding toward timber or turtle was not a surrender. It was an investment in steadier returns with fewer funerals. Women on the coast do not stride into the record with the same noise as famous captains, but they anchor it in ways the paper trail only half catches. Traders took canoes upriver with cloth, beads, and iron. They came back with food, news, and agreements. Households in seasonal camps stabilized men who might otherwise have drifted in and out with the tide. Information traveled along kinship lines that ignored the flags ships flew. Alliance building often began in kitchens and courtyards, not on beaches. Glimpses in letters and ledgers show names involved in barter, in refuge, in warning a camp before a patrol arrived. Gaps remain, and they deserve mention without fantasy. Where the record is thin, the acknowledgement matters more than imaginative filling. The social glue beneath raids often had a woman's hand on it. even when official eyes refuse to see. Case files and personalities turn generalities into episodes. A captain with more nerve than caution pushes a sloop across a bar at dusk, guided by a Mosquito pilot who taps the gunwale twice when the wave rises right. A Spanish officer writes a frustrated letter about a settlement burned to ash, only to note in a line that reads like a sigh that the same faces were spotted upriver a month later with new canoes and the same dogs at their feet. A British magistrate, aware of diplomacy's delicate threads, delivers gifts to a recognized king at Sandy Bay and writes with carefully neutral pride about good order, as if describing a parlor instead of a wind-scrubbed shore. A missionary records baptisms in a hand steadier than the canoe he arrived in, then adds a note about the price of turtle oil rising when storms delayed the fleet. Each vignette shows what the larger picture sometimes hides: speed, betrayal, humor, and the way news outran sails along riverbanks. Archaeology and material traces show what stories often promise and sometimes miss. Surveys uncover camp scatters, shards of bottle glass, iron fastenings, nails hammered flat and repurposed, ballast stones where no bedrock offers them. Timbering sites carry the ghost grid of old work, stumps in a line, cut marks at a height that marks the average shoulder of a man long gone. Ballast dumps at lagoon edges create false coves of rounded stones from distant quarries. None of these feels like a treasure chest, because that is not what this economy meg. The use and move rhythm left few monuments. Coastal change helps the disappearance along accretion hides what erosion sometimes reveals. A storm exhumes a scatter, and the next storm buries it as if remembering modesty. Law, treaties, and great power politics made a paper weather that sometimes rained and sometimes blew away. British recognition of Mosquito leadership, for reasons of strategy and commerce, offered a counterweight to Spanish claims along shore. Spanish protests wrote eloquence into dispatches and added urgency to patrols. Protectorate claims shifted like tides, firm in London or Guatemala City, and soft in a mangrove creek at dusk. Conventions forced evacuations or relocations when metropolitan diplomats needed a neat line on a map for a year or two. Then local practice returned, adapted and smiling. Gray zones nurtured the Wild West feel, not because people disliked law, but because distant law did not seem to understand river mud. Echoes into the 19th century complicate any neat ending. Filibusters, freebooted political adventurers, looked at the river corridors and saw fast roads to dreams that did not belong to them. Canal schemes sketched ambitions across waters that ignored ink. The transition from pirate privateer economies to banana, rubber, and timber frontiers changed the names on payrolls without erasing the value of local river knowledge. New flags rose, old tactics guided the boat. Crews who had once guided raiders guided engineers, surveyors, and company men who learned, sometimes too late, that a map line does not tame a current. Decline and transformation came from a different set of tools. Steam power pushed deeper into rivers, though not everywhere. Stronger state presence seeded lighthouses and chart updates that made the surprise of a bar less likely. For outsiders, professional navies gained speed of communication and coordination that punched holes in improvisation. Coastal towns consolidated. Papers were demanded where handshakes had once stood in for them. Law finally looked like uniforms and stamps, not canoes and consensus. Though under the surface, practices survived. Quiet smuggling, family networks, the art of crossing a bar in a swell without announcing it to the world. Legacy and identity live in present tense mouths and music. Maritime skills, how to hear a squall coming through a gap, how to read the color of a lagoon under high noon, are still taught. Language carries loanwords and rhythms that tie the coast to wider Caribbean currents. Oral histories recount raids without romance and alliances without apology. Mosquito, Creole, and Garifuna communities remember the coast as work, risk, and pride. Place names keep stories the way a shelf keeps books. Bluefields, Sandy Bay, Black River, Corn Islands, each a title, each still illustrated by lives. Family names link campfire tales to today's boat launchers. Pride intertwines with pain and pragmatism. Few tell a simple story and none need to. Ethical travel and storytelling matter because the coast is not a stage set. Respect for communities and land rights replaces a treasure hunting fantasy with curiosity that pays attention. Protected waters exist to guard life. They are not obstacles to someone else's adventure. Engagement with sources and sites works best through museums, community historians, and the people whose grandparents shaped the shoreline with their hands. Stories told with care last longer than those told with fever. The difference isn't in adjectives. It is in listening before speaking and in checking a thrilling line against a ledger or a letter when such a record exists. A closing arc gathers the threads without tightening them into something the place itself would reject. The hook returns with calm force. A Caribbean Wild West built not on tavern glamour, but on reefs, rivers, and relationships. The clear takeaway stands. The Mosquito Coast reshaped piracy and privateering by fusing indigenous power with shallow water tactics and a cash and contraband economy. Influence did not always radiate from famous islands. Sometimes it flowed quietly from a lagoon at dawn, where a canoe slid into a channel, the color of tea. The decisive invitation rests gently. Weigh the frontier freedoms that drew crews here against the costs paid by local peoples who made the frontier possible. See this shore not as a footnote or a backdrop, but as piracy's most revealing frontier, one that explains more by existing than any long duel ever could. The coast invites a slower look, the kind that settles under the skin and replaces quick stereotypes with details that feel lived in. Picture a sloop at daybreak, canvas still damp. The sea the color of brewed tea where river water spreads into the Caribbean. The helmsman keeps the bow just off the bar, reading not instruments but the way foam breaks on brown water. A Mosquito pilot, barefoot and sure, watches the cloud line for signs of squalls scooped between hills. He taps his knuckles twice on the gunwale when the wave rises right. The boat slides over the lip, into the lagoon, and the world goes quiet. Mangrove roots like fingers, a mirror of water, and the muffled sound of paddles from somewhere deeper inside. This is not a stage for grand fleets. It is a place where small decisions win the long game. Let's take it step by step. The draw was never lawlessness for its own sake. The draw was a working frontier where official rules lagged behind reality. Crews could repair, resupply, and trade where governors could not inspect every barrel. Indigenous allies could negotiate terms that placed their priorities alongside anyone else's, not under them. A captain who misread the current political or title found himself stuck, and a captain who listened found doors opening where maps showed only green and blue. Quick fact: the value of logwood came not from its weight, but from its color. When shaved and boiled in European workshops, it dyed cloth, the kinds of blues and blacks craftsmen prized. That meant a cluster of men with axes and a chain of buyers across the sea. It also meant the kind of export that traveled well by water and sat in stacks that drew less attention than silver. Mahogany later added heft and prestige, massive planks that became tables and paneling, the kind of furniture that outlived the men who cut it. None of that labor was romantic on the ground. It meant insects, it meant sweat, it meant nights of smoke-thick air to keep mosquitoes at bay. Yet each raft of wood sliding toward the bar meant coins somewhere else. The coast hummed with a quiet arithmetic: cut, cure, float, sell, repeat. Turtling looked gentle from a distance and harsh from up close. Crews eased into shallows at night, watched shadows glide, and turned centuries of observation into food and oil. The craft was patient and skilled, a hand on a shell, a timing learned from elders, a calm rope around flippers. The catch fed camps and garrisons, the oil-filled lamps in houses that never saw the Caribbean. The work smelled like salt and smoke, and made a ledger balance in a way that rating alone could not guarantee. Heads up on this: the very turtles that built livelihoods also wore stories in their shells, roots remembered across generations. Beaches returned to with a loyalty that crews respected, even as they relied on the catch. In that paradox, dependence and care, camp life found one of its quiet rhythms. The outline of Spanish response is familiar in records across the Caribbean, but the Mosquito Coast gave it a specific face. Coastal patrols did not fear battle, they feared ignorance. A frigate could not will itself into 3 feet of water, and an officer trained for line-of-battle maneuvers faced a test that the manual never taught: humility. Punitive expeditions worked when they met their targets on beaches or in open river mouths. They stumbled when they chased into creeks that narrowed without warning, or when storms turned a week's schedule into a month's. Garrisoning required more than soldiers. It required fresh food, healthy water, and the knowledge that a spring fever would not have the roster before the next set of orders arrived. So camps burned and reappeared, sloops were seized and replaced, proclamations disbanded settlements that kept living in different places, under different names, with the same dogs, sleeping by the same fires. Between wars, paper flowed like tides. Letters of marque made familiar crews respectable to some, and intolerable to others. A captain who 1 month dodged patrols could the next present himself to a governor, hat in hand, commission on paper, and carry similar goods along similar routes, with a new stamp affixed. The European chessboard, wars declared in royal halls, moved the pieces from Tortuga to Jamaica, to the Bay Islands, to the Mosquito shore, but it did not change the shape of the board on the ground. Rivers, bars, winds. Practical men adjusted, and practical allies responded in kind. A welcome extended to a privateer did not erase a memory of a broken promise last season. It hedged against the new risks, while extracting the new benefits. Attested, commissions reshaped reputations overnight. Contested, any claim that a seal and ribbon changed the hearts of neighbors who still had to live with the outcomes. River war deserves a separate breath. Picture canoes pulled onto banks under low branches, their sides smoothed by hands and years. Picture a quiet force of men, eating, sharpening, listening for the sound that does not belong. The creak of a foreign rudder, the laughter of men who have not yet learned that the forest carries voices. Night movements, suited crews who did not need lanterns to see. Sandbars learned the names of those who crossed them and punished the names of those who didn't. Portages were not heroics, they were muscle memory. Lift, shift, step, set down, breathe, repeat. The corridor, up the San Juan, to the lake and beyond, glittered as a dream in European minds, a water stairway to the Pacific. It punished that dream faithfully, marching men through heat and steam, feeding them well enough, keeping powder dry and keeping morale intact. These became the battles before any battle. The few lines in later biographies that mention a young naval officer paying for ambition with sickness on that river corridor are reminders, not curiosities, that the jungle counts the cost evenly. A mixed world emerged along the inlets and paths. The way people greeted each other told a story. The combination of languages, the switch of words, the laughter that smoothed over a mispronunciation. A Mosquito leader arrived with kin and allies, leaning into a role shaped by both local authority and foreign recognition. A Creole boat builder haggled over planks, his eye on the grain and the knot, not on a flag. A maroon hunter pointed upriver with a chin, not a finger, and traded a warning for a favor to be decided later. A British serial, scarred, clear-eyed, returned to a camp that had already made room for him with a cup and a chore. Others from Cuba, from the Lesser Antilles, from coastal towns to the north and south, drifted in and out, not a melting pot, but a stew where textures remained and flavors merged. Camp justice reflected that mix. When a man stole from the common stores, his punishment crafted 2 lessons at once. He could not eat at ease on others' effort, and the group could not afford to be vindictive when the next storm might require all hands. Even the sea language of the coast carried light touches from everywhere. A reef that forced the bow into a predictable shimmy earned a nickname that meant the same thing in 3 tongues. A certain gust through a gap had a name that made children grin and elders nod. The kids grew into helmsmen and pilots. They taught apprentices where to tie knots, so the weight fell right on the wrist. not the fingers. In that transmission, practical sung as a work chant, told as a joke, corrected with a patient smile. The maritime identity of the coast took its shape. A museum could explain some of it in a label. A morning crossing taught more. Smuggling refined itself into a gentle science. Papers could be forged, but a tone of voice could not. A false flag might present a clean silhouette from afar, but a patrol's spyglass could still catch the wrong rigging choice. The best trick remained the simplest: be where patrols didn't expect, at hours they didn't prefer, under weather they didn't love. Signals across lagoons stayed discreet. A single lantern hung at a lower rung than usual. A sail reefed one panel more than the wind demanded. A bluff with a stand of palmettos lit at its base for 10 minutes, and then went dark. Those who needed to know understood. Those who didn't shrugged at a shepherd's fire or a fisherman's late supper. Routes to Jamaica and the Bay Islands kept money turning. Routes inland kept food and news rich. Garrisons bought the same smoked fish as giants and the same salt as smallholders. A frontier like this narrows the distance between the official and the ordinary. Myth stepped in wherever memory left gaps and made the story too tidy for its own good. Tales of entire buried cities of thieves, row after row of taverns, and brazen signs on beaches do not match caches of bottle glass and iron nails. The place gave work to imagination, but it did not surrender to it. Eyewitnesses who cared about accuracy recorded weather and wood, a scarcity of nails, a sudden fever, and the way a certain river changed course by a dozen paces after a storm. Where later writers set skulls on maps, earlier records set depth soundings and the direction of prevailing winds in the wet season. That does not flatten the legend, it focuses it. When a coast survives in oral history for centuries, the strongest lines are the modest ones. The bar is higher after the storm. The lagoon lies when the wind is behind you. The frogs go quiet at midnight in that bend. These are not grand statements, but they saved more lives than a poem about a cursed cave ever could. Survival rules were sparse and relentless. Storms arrived without apology and left with the ground rearranged. Fevers punished the brave and the unwary. The same way, a careened hull rested on stakes that might shift in the night if the tide coaxed them to. A shortage of fresh water turned strong men sour. Medicine arrived in the form of leaves bruised into paste, bark shaved into tea, and prayers said under breath while someone cooled a forehead by a smoky fire. The community's knowledge, particularly held by women and elders, closed the gap between what a sailor knew and what a forest insisted required respect. That partnership kept camps whole. It did not make them invincible, and no voice with experience ever pretended otherwise. The arithmetic clicked without romance. A small coaster taken on a sandbar yielded a modest haul of flour, cloth, maybe casks of molasses or a pot of coin. Divide, subtract costs, tuck away a share for repairs and count again only when barrels were full and sails tight. Outfitting a sloop cost less than courting favor in the right court. Losing one meant more to a family than to a ledger in a far capital. That scale made the coast a magnet for those who preferred many small successes to one grand throw. It also made the frontier a school for cautious boldness. Captains who lasted knew when to slip and when to stand, when to bring a prize home and when to let it pass because a patrol waited a mile farther out, dressed as a fisherman. Women's work stretched beyond provisioning and into the subtle labor that made alliances durable. A basket of cassava, delivered to a camp at dusk, carried quiet terms along with food. A marriage, blessed and celebrated in a blend of traditions, linked households and promised safe passage across certain stretches. Traders negotiated with the kind of patience that outlasted a captain's temper. They built networks that sent warnings through kitchens clear across lagoons. Children learned 2 or 3 languages before they measured 5 feet in height, and they grew into adults who translated more than words. The record shows their names only sometimes. Where it does not, it shows outcomes that do not make sense without them. A few vignettes bring the whole shore into focus. A sloop lies on her side near the mouth of a creek, propped on timbers, Men scraping barnacles and caulking seams with pitch that smells like a cook fire. Dogs fan their ears and sleep under the hull's shade. A canoe glides in with 2 women and a boy at the paddle. Plantains heaped in the bow. A bundle of letters tucked under a cloth near the stern, bound for a man who can read and will read aloud. The boy listens with the blood-still attention of someone who wants to be the one who reads next year. He will learn to sign his name with a flourish, and to tie a particular knot in the dark with his left hand. The sloop will go back to sea. The canoe will slip upriver before the afternoon wind makes the lagoon chatter. The letters will alter a plan, save a life, and start an argument that ends in a laugh. In another corner of the coast, a Spanish officer sits at a rough desk with good paper laid on a plank. He writes by daylight because he does not trust the candle to behave in the humidity. He describes a raid, a pursuit, and a storm that scattered the patrol like gulls. He adds a line that betrays admiration. The enemy knows these waters better than we do, and another that betrays weariness. The men complain of biting insects and no dry floor. He draws a sketch of a bar with arrows that show where the river now runs and where it ran last season. He seals the letter with wax that sweats, hands it to a courier who will find a boat, and understands that by the time it is read, the bar will have moved again. His honesty becomes a kind of service the coast repays in respect. Far to the northeast, a governor reads a report, frowns, and asks for a list of ships fit for shallow water. The list is short. He writes back with orders that sound decisive on paper and thin on the tide. The same governor meets with a Mosquito envoy a month later, sets gifts on a table, a musket, braided cloth, a knife with a handle carved like a fish, and speaks the language of statecraft with care. The envoy accepts, replies in a measured tone, and leaves with the same confidence he brought, that his people's strength comes from the shore, not from a signature. The governor understands more than he admits and less than he knows he should. The coast keeps teaching, one small test at a time. Archaeology's patience matches the coast's. A team in the dry season walks a line of shore where storms sheared off a scarf of sand. The year before, they find a scatter, a greened nail, a shard of bottle with a rolled lip, a flat pebble that should not be here because the nearest river capable of carrying such stone lies far up current. They map, note, and leave the site quiet. They return in the next dry season and find that the sea has given them a little more. Another team follows a trough in the lagoon floor and finds a bed of stones, rounded, wrong for the geology, right for ballast. None of it is a chest. All of it confirms life lived in the cadence the record already suggests. Later a storm returns what the sea borrowed, and they switch to another cove, patient as hermits and as stubborn as mangroves. The law insists on making sense of a place that resists neat lines, and treaties draft sense into paragraphs whenever possible. Recognition of Mosquito kings by British officials wrote a shape into a relationship already working on its own logic. Spanish protests wrote conscience into government that faced the insult of raids and the limitation of resources. Protectorate claims labeled a coast that had long ago labeled itself in practice. Conventions drawn up at tables far from the smell of salt required evacuations that lasted longer on paper than on land. The coast tolerated the theater, adapted around it, and went on, where paper law aligned with lived law. Respect for a fishing ground, a promise about a river mouth. Peace lived there like a bird on a nest. Where paper law contradicted lived law, tension returned until someone remembered which one fed families. The 19th century poured new kinds of ambition down old channels. Filibusters saw the river corridors and imagined banners where households imagined sleep. Canal planners traced in pencil across wetlands that erased their wrongness in an afternoon thunderstorm. Contractors arrived with boots and marching orders and left with stories about how the land rejected hurry. At the same time, new export frontiers, bananas, rubber, timber, converted the vocabulary of raiding into the vocabulary of logistics. The same pilots who could land a periagua at night could land a company, launch at dawn, The same women who once traded iron and cloth traded tin cups and soap. Wages replaced shares, ledgers grew thicker, the cost did not disappear. It moved into different columns and touched different nerves. Steam did not conquer every bend. It did change possibilities. A shallow draft steamer nosed where a deep keeler would never try, and then stopped, humbled, when a fallen tree crossed the channel like a bar. Lighthouses looked west with steady eyes and made reef work less cruel for those who could afford to carry charts. Telegraph lines elsewhere quickened decisions on this coast by a day or a week, not by an hour. The frontier thinned as uniforms and stamps made appearances in more coves, yet beneath the new formalities old habits survived with the discipline of things that work. A certain stroke with the paddle, a certain way of loading cargo, so a boat sits right on the wave, a certain habit of listening for voices that should not be there. Smuggling did not vanish, it learned new faces. Legacy refuses to live in glass alone. Music carries rhythms that roadmen kept with paddles and that women kept with mortars and pestles. Language picks up and keeps words that have no equal anywhere else. Children still learn to watch the horizon and to taste the air when the weather changes. Oral histories do not fear contradiction. They welcome each other with phrases like, "as my grandmother told it," and "as the old men say at dawn." Each recollection adds a layer that makes the past wider, not narrower. In that widening respect grows, not as a polite guest, but as a resident understanding of how many sorts of people made the coast what it was and is. Ethical storytelling asks for no special ceremony, only for listening to precede speaking, and for curiosity to be matched with care. The coast is full of protected waters, not because someone wanted to slow down tourists, but because life there regrows at its own speed. Community historians, people who keep records in desk drawers and in memories as carefully as archives, keep them in temperature-controlled rooms, offer context that turns a neat theory into a generous truth. A respectful traveler leaves a lighter wake than a reckless one, and learns more. The portrait, at this point, is not a romance of piracy. It is a panorama of a frontier where piracy was one of the occupations that fit the setting. The Mosquito Coast did not imitate Tortuga or Nassau. It built its own form of power, grounded in shallow water, tall trees, and the way courage looks when it's quiet. It measured time in seasons, not in headlines. It measured achievement in return trips, not in ballads. Its story replaces the urge for a single famous name with a respect for many names in ledgers, letters, and family lines. A slow walk through the closing ideas steadies the mind. The coast worked because relationships worked between Mosquito leaders and British officials, between camp cooks and pilots, between children and their elders, between rivers and the sea. Those relationships adjusted under pressure. When Spanish patrols grew bold, camps moved. When storms rearranged channels, knowledge shifted and made itself new. When wars issued commissions, crews took them and did what they had done with a new stamp on the same barrel. When treaties insisted on neatness, the coast taught neatness how to coexist with the honest mess of life. Quick fact: canal dreams on this latitude are older than many realize. The sea whispered them into ears, because from a height, water looks like a road. The coast answered with mud, with fevers, with the physics of lifting boats over places where even a canoe must be carried by hands. That answer did not shame ambition, it seasoned it. Ambition sometimes thinks only of distance. The coast taught it to think of height, heat, and the human heart under a wet shirt. That is not a small education. It helps at the end to listen again to a morning on a lagoon. A boat moves so gently it seems to float without effort. A kingfisher dives and shakes itself clean on a branch that leans like a question mark over the water. Voices carry two men discussing whether the sandbar has moved. A woman calling a child to hold the other end of a net, the scratch of a dog that doesn't want to get up yet. Farther out, the sea meets the river in a line that shifts with each hour. Beyond that, someone who doesn't know the coast looks for a harbor that the map promised and hears only wind. The lagoon always knew both sides would be there. The map did. A careful recap honors the shape that held all these moments together. The Mosquito Coast drew and held crews because it offered more than hiding places. It offered a way to live and work on terms that were not dictated by the biggest ship or the loudest proclamation. Indigenous power was not a background note. It was the keynote. Shallow water tactics were not makeshift. They were refined. The frontier economy was not a thin excuse. It was the scaffolding that kept communities intact through seasons and wars. Spanish reprisals were real and often brave. Geography and alliances made them expensive. Letters of marque blurred lines to the benefit of those who understood how to read a political tide, as well as a tidal bar. Rivers were roads, courts, and occasionally ambushes. They were also the reason this story does not belong to a single city or a single hall of power. For what declined here was not human skill, but the need for the exact arrangement that made piracy profitable. Technology, charts, stronger states, and new economies edited the script. What remained were the people, their songs, their words, their boats, their pride, and the places, the bars, the passes, the lagoons that continued to demand respect. The coast did not become tame, it became itself with different pressures on it. The endpoint in a story like this is not a closing door. It is an opening invitation. The frontier's costs belong in the same frame as its freedoms. Local peoples paid in labor, in risk, and sometimes in life, for a way of living that kept outside power from drawing too straight a line on their shore. Their successes were practical and cumulative, not spectacular and singular. That is why the coast teaches better than it dazzles. It shows how decisions that fit a place can outlast decisions that fit a paper plan. The narrative returns to its first promise without changing tone. A forgotten shore took center stage because readers of the world learned how to read the map differently. Where jungle rivers met warm Caribbean currents, fast sloops, Mosquito allies, and logwood fortunes indeed turned a quiet edge into a rough frontier, half marketplace, half battleground. Not the cartoon of pirates, not the myth of endless taverns, but a landscape of real work, real danger, and a kind of rough peace earned daily. The clearest takeaway sits steady. The Mosquito Coast reshaped piracy and privateering by fusing indigenous power with shallow water craft and a frontier economy that valued speed, knowledge, and relationships over show. One last image carries the weight home. A sloop edges out of a lagoon at dusk, the bar inactive for once, the swell cooperative. In the stern, an older woman ties off a bundle with the expertise of someone who has seen every mistake and made fewer because of them. In the bow, a pilot listens to waves he cannot see yet. Midships, a boy fingers a coin and asks a question about the next bend in the river they will visit when they return. The answers come with patience. They always have. The sea darkens. The last mangrove root disappears under shadow. The boat finds the pass and leans into it. The frontier is not behind. It is within the people who know this water. And for anyone who has listened closely tonight, that frontier is no longer a blank at the map's edge, but a living, instructive place where pirates learn to be very small and very skilled in a very large world, and where communities taught that skill to anyone wise enough to listen. The curtain falls softly, not with a clatter, because this shore deserves a quiet nod more than a shout. The lesson stands where wind meets river. Power here was never only in cannon or decree. It was in hands on paddles, eyes on bars, minds tuned to weather, and promises kept in camps that left few ruins and many descendants. As the last light slips off the reef and the reef begins to hum with night, the invitation lingers for the viewer to weigh frontier freedom against the costs paid, and to see this coast not as a footnote, but as one of piracy's most revealing frontiers. An honest teacher, steady as a tide.